Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the first session of Sports Law 101. Sports Law 101 is the latest initiative of the Sports Law and Policy Center, where experts from the field will cover contemporary sports law and policy issues through monthly discussions. Our topic for today is conflict of interest in sport. Let me introduce you to our speaker, Mr. Nandan Kamath, Principal Lawyer at Law NK and Managing Trustee at the Go Sports Foundation. And our host for this evening is Mr. Jonathan Vigo, Senior Sports Consultant. Before we begin, I would like to request everybody to please keep their mics and cameras switched off for the entire duration of the session. And if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box on Zoom, and our speakers will try to address them at the end of the session. So all over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Yogita, and it's good to be back with Nandan again. I'll be on camera and on what you can say remotely. But hello everybody, and welcome to Sports Law and Policy Center, Sports Law 101. I think this is something that I've been looking for myself. I'm not a lawyer, but I think this is extremely critical to have a conversation around stuff that surrounds the sporting ecosystem. We are all too keen always on talking about the achievements of players, the achievements of teams. We just faced probably what was one of the most historic test wins, but rarely talk about the things that happen, the things and the people that make this machine run. And one of the topics, I think one of the topics we often feel confused about, and I'm not, when I say we, I include myself, just to be clear, although I'm leading this conversation I would say it's on behalf of all you attendees. The topics that has confused me very often is conflict of interest. It is one of those topics that tends to be something that everybody has an opinion about. Most people think they know what it is, but of course there is both a legal explanation for it and even a layman application. And that's why, I thought when Nandan said that Nandan and his team said they wanted to do something like this, I said, I'd definitely love to be part of it. So once again, Nandan, good to catch up with you. Let's just get started, I guess. I think the first question is, and to kick off the conversation, what is conflict of interest? And if you can help us both understand from a legal perspective as well as for layman understanding.
No, Jonathan, likewise, great to be back speaking with you. As a very, very brief introduction, I would like to say what conflict of interest is and what it is not as well. So it is not just a crime. It's not a bad thing in and of itself. In fact, it's one of the most natural things in a field like sport. And when I say natural, what is conflict of interest? We are all a multitude of interests, right? So we have many different pulls on our time. We have many different pulls on our interests, and we have a finite amount of time, finite amount of energy to give to all of those. So we live conflicted lives all the time. But conflict of interest in sport itself is, again, very, very natural. There are multiple people who, as they go up the ladder in sport, end up playing multiple different roles. And in many ways, as you get more senior, as you get more specialized, you're more likely to be offering your services in a more sharp manner to a larger number of enterprises or organizations, and to have certain interests of your own. And at the same time, when you look at sort of the junior levels of sport, people participating as entrepreneurs, participating as freelancers, the future of work is not going to be about doing one thing only. It's about doing many different things. And what is an interest? An interest is when you are beholden to something, or you want to push something, or you gain from something. A conflict of interest essentially is when there is more than one of those interests. So something is pulling in one direction, another thing is pulling in another. And these two end up clashing. Now, the clash in itself is not a problem, but the context in which a clash might occur and the context and relevance of that leads to some conflicts of interest which are inappropriate and some which are completely manageable and natural. So I think the first thing one has to be clear on is you can't demonize and criminalize all sorts. So it's not a crime. It's the most natural thing in any profession, but at the same time, it is also not irrelevant. So I think you have one stream of thought which says, oh, conflict of interest, bad, bad, bad. On the other, it's, oh, I'm in this position and I'm a decent person. So why are you sort of accusing me of conflict of interest? I'm not doing anything bad. And I think the reality is somewhere in between of the balance between understanding context and balancing the various different interests. Also being able to sort of separate and understand what interests are. Are they private interests? Are they public interests? And in many ways, are they also quasi-public interests? And this has very direct relevance to sport and sports bodies and governance. I mean, no one can argue any longer that when you're in a governance position in a sports federation, you're playing a public function. In fact, that is the Supreme Court sort of literal quote. So you may not be a public authority, but you're certainly performing a public function, an important public function. So any person in reasonably senior positions in a sports body is going to be sort of pushing a quasi-public. And when that interest clashes with some personal or private interest they have, either directly or through someone they may be beholden to, paid by, related to, or in some other way under the influence of, what you see is that quasi-public interest or the public interest potentially being either diluted or an appearance of impropriety, which is also bad enough. So it's not about whether you exercise your other interests. It is that you are in a position where you're capable of being questioned. So to me, in very simple terms, it's conflict of interest is natural. It is not nothing, but it is also not per se a bad thing. You have to sort of parse it, understand it, and sort of really segment the interests, look at the clash, and look at whether that clash is indeed resolvable, is it not resolvable, and what is the appropriate remedy for it. So really all conflict of interest has to be managed. And unless it is managed, I think it leaves large and important questions open in the governance and balance of sport. Because really what is sports governance? Sports governance is the balancing of all these various interests, right? I think it's one public entity or public function is the balance of a multitude of private functions. So you have players, you have broadcasters, you have sponsors, you have intermediaries, you have agents. Everyone is pulling, right? And what are you doing in the center? You're standing firm. Now, are you standing firm and giving a little bit here, giving a little bit there for the right reasons, or for reasons that you may have sort of self-dealing interests in? And that is where conflict of interest comes into play in the governance of sport. Are decisions being made in the public sphere, in the public interest, or are they being influenced in an inappropriate manner, or potentially being seen to be influenced by some other pull which should not be in consideration when finding that balance? I think that's in short how I would introduce the concept itself.
Right. And from what I take from one of the things you said, which is first of all, you mentioned something about perception of conflict. And that was, I know we've spoken about this earlier, and it's something that I will revisit later in this call. And I want to kind of probe you further on it. But, it just seems like, it seems as though conflict of interest has this weight hanging around it. Just the concept has got this massive cloud, dark cloud hanging over it and it's almost, like you said, the words you used at the start, it's almost criminalized and demonized right at the start, right? Oh, this is a conflict of interest. He or she might be doing something wrong. And it often just seems it feels like it's a very nuanced concept. It's not as simple as black or white. You have to actually lay context to it. You have to provide perspective to it and actually find a way to resolve it, as opposed to bringing down the axe or bringing down the hammer. Nandan, if I may kind of push you a little and say, is there a way to probably, and this is somehow something that I do to understand a concept, is there some sort of a hypothetical random example you can create on what could a conflict of interest constitute for in sport?
Yeah, so I think before that, I'd just like to get back to the point of, you said people don't necessarily understand it. And I think we muddle it up with lots of other things. We muddle it up with, in some sense, VIP culture, where it's natural. Right. Someone in a public position maybe uses a public car, uses public resources for private purposes. So we're quite comfortable with that, right? Public officials, in some sense, gaining some private advantages. We also, in some sense, liken it with cheating, that you're taking from something and you're influencing rules in an inappropriate manner. Now, when you put all of those filters on top of it, the person on the other side of it, one feels naturally, I've reached this public position. In many of these sports bodies, it's an honorary position. I'm doing it out of the goodness of my heart. What's wrong if I get a little bit of private sort of compensation? I'm an honorary secretary, I'm honorary president. What's wrong with it? On the other hand, if you're trying to call me a cheat or a criminal, I'm not doing any of that. I'm behaving completely appropriately. But the issue is really of propriety, right? And I think you wanted hypotheticals. And we've had these real examples in the past. So someone is the president of a federation, and their son or daughter is in the zone of consideration for selection. Could be one of these issues, right? Another could be that they have an interest in one of the vendors. And these are all actually simple issues within corporate governance itself. You don't even need to get into sports governance for it. Is when you have some interest that is extraneous to what is specifically under consideration. That interest needs to be, one, on the table, and two, you have to determine whether that is going to potentially influence the way that a decision is going to be made. Now, that is obviously going to vary by the seniority of the person and the capability of that person to influence decisions, right? Now, I gave you the selection example, but on the other hand, let's say someone is the logistics manager of an IPL team, and they also run a cricket academy back home in the other 10 months of the year, right? So in many ways, people say conflict of interest. You're a coach, but you're also official of an IPL team. Now, if you dig down and deeper, like what influence is the person going to have in managing the logistics, the ticketing, the hotels and other things of an IPL team, just because you have an academy? Maybe the person needs to just put it out to the IPL team. It's a private interest the IPL team adverts to. It's not like he's going to book business class for the people from his academy and economy class for the other people, right? So I think you have to parse it. The existence of conflict of interest, again, I want to state, is natural. And in fact, I wouldn't go to the extent of saying it to be encouraged, but it is going to be a very natural part of sport as people who are playing sport come back to sport. I think we'll talk a little bit more down the road about seasonality, but also the freelancing in sport, which is going to have not just senior professionals, but young people dealing with different sports, dealing in different capacities through the course of a single year across many different seasons of many different sports.
Right.
And the concept has to be understood better, because unless we understand it, we're going to be leaving a lot on the table and in fact breaking the economy of sport in certain ways which actually slow us down.
That's an interesting point you bring up there, Nandan. And it's something that I even saw in your article that you had written a couple of years ago for News 18, and we also discussed it yesterday. I'll come back to that, which is you talk about how something that everybody thinks they understand, but is actually largely misunderstood, for lack of a better word. It actually impacts the sporting economy in a very severe way. If you and it'll be a long run impact if you don't fix things right now. So I'm going to come back to that. But I wanted to get an understanding from you as to, see, the Indian sports industry is evolving, right? So India has been playing sport for a century, more than a century. But the ecosystem, the organization of it is now evolving. And, I know many people will disagree with me, and this is my personal opinion here. A lot of that evolution was fast-tracked. Some of it was fast-tracked with the '83 World Cup win, and a lot of that has now been fast-tracked with the arrival of the IPL. So when did conflict of interest actually first start being taken seriously? When did conflict of interest first start being taken seriously in Indian sport? And especially from a legal standpoint of view, when did policies start coming to place? When did structures start coming to place? And what are some things that exist currently within that framework in India?
So it's an interesting question. I think it presumes that it is being taken seriously at this point of time, Jonathan. I think it's taken seriously.
I accept my naiveness there.
But as a legal concept, I think it first found its way, obviously, in the Lodha Committee report and the Supreme Court decisions. Not that it's a new issue. Like I said, related party transactions in corporate law, very natural, have to be disclosed. SEBI guidelines are there. There's no shortage of the underlying concept itself. But like I said, in sport, this honorary capacity and the expectation that when you're in a governance capacity, you're almost expected to do things to your own benefit, I think has been for the large part the way in which governance has occurred. And the break from that really came with Supreme Court intervention, and a number of PILs, different people have filed cases as well on this. And really, in terms of most sports bodies, global sports bodies, all of them have ethics codes where conflict of interest, gifting, all of these things are very, very core to it. There's an ethics committee. And all of these were actually, it's there in the IOA constitution because it needs to be there from the IOC. But the first, I think, codification, and if I may argue, over-codification of it is in the BCCI constitution pursuant to the Lodha Committee report as well as the Supreme Court judgment. So there, Rule 38 and the surrounding provisions under it actually require the sort of disclosure of conflict of interest. It goes into great detail of what it considers conflicts of interest, and also makes a sort of list of 10 or 12 different things, saying that you can't do more than one of these things at the same time. So, and also sort of what it distinguished between was what it called tractable interests and intractable interests, and tried to sort of put out a mechanism by the creation of an ethics officer role to try and help the BCCI resolve a bunch of these conflicts. So that, in the front and center, you've seen in the last 5-6 years, more and more talk of conflict of interest, more and more discussion. And I think that comes from the Supreme Court decision, as well as the codification of this. Now, whether they got it right or not, I think is a matter of debate. And I hold views on both sides of the equation. I think it's good to bring this out and to get an issue. But I would say more understanding and more balance is needed, because it can't be taken out of thin air and placed as a legal concept. It's an ethical, commercial, sort of moral concept which needs legal backing, because it needs to be managed, it needs to be controlled, and it needs to be, in some sense, the ultimate sort of the phrase of sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? To know what's happening, because the minute you're not disclosing stuff and things happen in hiding, and you don't even know why reasons for why some things are happening, the sort of the mystique grows, the suspicion grows, and sort of the respect for fair play, which is the role of the federation, also takes quite a beating.
Right. And, I actually went through, in preparation for this meeting, I had never had to, but now I actually went through the ethics code that BCCI has laid out. And and you see, I'll admit that I see the world through sometimes the lens that I wear. And one of the things that are close to me is commentary and podcasting and talking about sport, right? And, I follow the NBA very closely. I'm an NBA fan. And what I found interesting was that there was players mentioned on the top of the list, which is pretty much the epitome of that BCCI list. And then at the bottom, somewhere in the middle, there was commentators mentioned. And for me, I felt that stood out for me, because I watched the NBA, and often you find a player who has been eliminated in the first round of the playoffs actually join the commentary panel on a lot of join the commentary panel for the finals. And this, I don't necessarily see a conflict of interest there, and it kind of ties into what you said a little earlier, which is probably there is a bit of an overcompensation here with regards to the way BCCI has put this together. Where do you see the BCCI, or how do you see the BCCI ethics code being impacting the movement or the dealing with conflict of interest ahead? Is there a nuance that they're willing to listen to? I also do understand they've passed some rulings as well, some orders. What is your opinion on how that conversation is progressing?
So first of all, BCCI didn't do this; they were forced to do it, right? Not like you blame BCCI for the
right.
It was the point of the committee. Say a bit enthusiastic, like you put this out, right? Commentary is not in some games in which players from the field are commentating, they give you comments. But what they did is essentially took any content, added to this list of 12 or different different rules. Now you would have to argue that being a commentator is possibly in conflict with running a player management agency, right? You sort of pump up a certain player who you are managing, whose interests could be benefited from favorable comment. You could also be a commentator and sort of pushing someone from your academy and claiming that they're very good. So you do
Well, it seems we maybe Nandan's dropped off because of an internet connection. I also see a question that has come from Nishant Daswani. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. How do we differentiate between an ethical conflict of interest in sport and unethical interest in sport, as there is a very thin line of difference between them? Nikhil, I'm a little upset with you because you kind of took the words out of my mouth. No, I'm kidding. It is definitely something we're going to talk about. It's actually one of the things. So I'm actually impressed that you foresaw that we had this thing lined up. So we'll definitely be addressing it. We've got Nandan back on.
Yeah, sorry, I dropped off for a second there. But I was just saying it could be a conflict of interest if someone is a commentator and running an academy, or someone is a commentator and running a player agency, right? You can see that there's a conflict. But it may not be a conflict if someone is a commentator and, I mean, they included there is in the list is legal service provider, right? There's very little you can do in conflict, but it'd be interesting to find what that might be.
That will happen. That will happen when you get your commentating gig, London.
But what they did is they essentially took any types of conflicts and added it to this list. Now that caused, and talking about the cases that came up, right? So the way that they have it is anyone can complain, or a member of some state association can complain. The ethics officer can suo moto take up cases. So the first band of cases under this ethics code, there were a bunch of cases that came up under the BCCI old ethics code, which was not similar. It had a more generic concept of conflict of interest. But the first few that came up here were actually related to Tendulkar, Ganguly, and Lakshman, who formed the Cricket Advisory Committee of the BCCI. And the complaint was that all of them were related to also different franchises. And in addition, that Ganguly held the position of Cricket Association of Bengal president. Now, it was a very interesting case. If you read the cases, they're all online on the BCCI website. The BCCI took the position that these are conflicts, but they are tractable conflicts. They can be resolved. These have been disclosed. The Cricket Advisory Committee meets once a year. We don't see a major issue because we are comfortable with it. And a lot of these are not issues that generally come up. Now, the ethics officer went very, very strictly by this list of incompatible roles. He said it really doesn't matter. In this list, you explain all the things that are potentially conflict of interest, but it says in the constitution, no person may hold more than one of these roles at the same time. And one of them was a committee of the BCCI and another was a franchise official. So he knocked them all back saying this is a conflict of interest. Without even understanding the context, understanding background, is there an issue? Can you distinguish someone being a mentor of a team versus someone being president of a federation? Are these all actually distinct cases that have to be looked at independently, or do you put them all in the same basket? Now, a few months later, we had the chance to represent Rahul Dravid in a similar matter. So the argument there was that he had been appointed as the head of cricket at the National Cricket Academy. And the argument was, since he was 18 years old, he had been playing for India Cements. So in the Chennai League, and had been employed by India Cements over the years. The argument was that made him an employee of India Cements, which had a franchise, which was Chennai Super Kings. So again, by the logic, the previous logic, the complainant essentially brought up that there was two roles that are listed in this list of 12. And because the two roles are there, you don't even need to look beyond. It's an open and shut case of conflict of interest. It's a different matter that Chennai Super Kings was actually not the direct owner of the franchisee. It was they had a separate SPV which they had spun out many years before for various different reasons. And a separate matter that Rahul Dravid had no role whatsoever in Chennai Super Kings. But separately, the ethics officer really had the chance to reconsider his position that he had taken in the previous few cases. So finally, he, I think, accepted that you can't look at this list of 12 things as just out of thin air. If there are two, you're knocked off. You have to look at that in the context of the understanding of what a conflict of interest is. It is not just holding more than two positions. And I think that comes out quite well in the Rahul Dravid decision. So he essentially says, okay, let's even accept for the sake of argument that he's an employee of a franchisee. So except, for example, that India Cements is a franchisee, let's say it owns Chennai Super Kings. In his role with rehab, planning, and other things at the NCA, he's not a selector. He's managing a National Cricket Academy. In what capacity could he influence decision making, which would be biased or eat into the interests of any one person? The NCA essentially takes anyone who comes for rehab, manages sort of coaching systems and setups. It has no selectorial role. So if you look at that decision, it was an evolution of this concept from hard-nosed, you can't have more than two roles, to a more nuanced, you have to understand the context. It's not just about the presence of more than one interest. These have to be truly incompatible. Now, if you look at what the BCCI had done in the first instance, it was totally appropriate. It is saying that there's more than one interest at play, but there's no intrinsic problems. These are not in conflict, in particular with the Tendulkar case and the Lakshman case. Once a year, they meet to select the national selectors. And during the IPL season, they are available to all the players of a particular franchise. These are not roles in which there's an automatic, they've disclosed, everyone knows about it, and we don't see a general problem. Now, that is a more nuanced way. But what ended up happening is the minute conflict of interest, the concept came up, everyone went on the defensive, because even the way that the process is set up, it's like accusatory. Someone is filing a complaint, you have to defend yourself. Conflict of interest, it's not about sort of stopping it from happening. It is about managing different interests and making sure there's an alignment of the various interests, removing interests which are inappropriate, but really starting first with disclosure as well as communication. And a large number of conflicts can be managed through disclosure, communication, and handling and management. Sort of the removal of conflicts and forcing someone to exit a position is really an extreme step, which is appropriate in a number of instances, but is not the only remedy. So, and I think the ability to bridge that. So you saw each of them, it became a sort of a media trial. It's almost like you saw, it was someone is accused of a crime of sorts, right? Which is completely inappropriate for what it is. It's a management tool to make sure the alignment of interests in a quasi-public position are not being influenced by private interests, and the reasons and logic are unbiased and in the interest of the sort of public position the person is taking.
And what you said there was really interesting, because it's not just about adding context to what is happening. It's also about what is the outcome of what you think has been the conflict of interest, right? When the people sitting on the judgment, on the panel are passing the order, passing the judgment, or reviewing this, it's also important to understand what outcome has come of these actions that you believe are at conflict, that has actually constitutes conflict of interest. Like you said, with Dravid's case, you mentioned, can you specify in what capacity did he influence anything in a way that is not appropriate for that matter? And for me, that's what stands out. It's about, and we spoke about this yesterday, it's in addition to context, it is also to help and understand, once you get the context, can you identify the results of those actions, and are those actually at odds with each other, or at odds with what is the right thing to do?
Absolutely. And also understanding, are these private interests or are they public interests? Very, very important differentiation to make.
Right.
A private interest can be waived, right? So let's say you're a freelancer, you work for two different companies. Sometimes you work for both on the same day. Some of the stuff you do for one company may be not necessarily fully aligned with the other company, but you tell both companies and both say that's fine. That is two private interests. But public interests are not waivable. I mean, I think some people misunderstand that, oh, we got the consent of people. These are not waivable because they are not capable of being waived. A public position is one where you have to stand up and above, not just behave properly, but the sort of the perception of propriety is as important as propriety itself. So when you accuse someone, and especially a famous athlete, the natural thing is, I'm not a bad person, I'm not doing anything wrong, and even if presented and influenced and given the opportunity, I'm not going to do something wrong. But it doesn't end there. It's not just about what you actually do or what you think you might do. It is, what does someone else sitting outside, does it question the position you hold, the propriety of the position, the reason decisions are made, the influence that could possibly play out to you. And these are, I think, perhaps less respected and less understood, because you throw the whole concept under the bus. Like you're essentially treating it as a black or white issue, while almost all of it is in shades of gray.
And that kind of adds to what we had said earlier, which is conflict of interest. Just like a lot of other legal concepts, is not only black and white. Right? You actually sit, and that's why we have a system that says, okay, here's a policy, here's a process. Let's go through. Let's ask the right questions, and let's come to a conclusion only once we have explored every element of the case. So that kind of takes me, and it's a perfect segue to my next question, Nandan, which is, what in your opinion are some of the ways we can address and start working towards resolving conflict of interest as it is without legal recourse? I mean, there has to be some way we can do it, and and we spoke about this yesterday, so I'd like you to kind of shed some light on that for our guests today.
Yeah, I think both sort of private bodies as well as these governance bodies, which are at minimum quasi-public, if not public in themselves, all need to have ethics codes and to implement them and to manage them. And I said that earlier, it's not about preventing conflict of interest. It is about managing and aligning interests and making sure there's propriety and balance within the decision-making sort of systems of a sports body. Where we've got to now, most sports bodies would have ethics committees, where, for example, in the BCCI scenario, you have an ethics officer who's also the ombudsman. So it's a quasi-judicial position. So this person is a former Supreme Court judge. And when a judge is a judge, whatever position you put the person in, right? He will wait for a complaint, hear both sides, natural justice, hear everyone, and give an order. Now the order is final and other people have to go and implement it. But in my view, that is not the way you manage conflict of interest. Management of conflict of interest has to be by a senior official who understands context and is able to rationalize and balance the various interests that come before them. Taking it to the final sort of judicial authority is the final step if it's incapable of management and resolution through an internal process. And waiting for a complaint or someone complaining, again, puts that person on the back foot, right? That it's corruption, someone's being accused of something and then has to defend themselves. In my view, the person who's the subject of the conflict should be an active participant in helping to resolve it. So stop demonizing it, stop sort of putting a pejorative label on top of it. And involve the person by explanation, by sort of resolution, and not that the person has to fully buy in, but I think they have to understand why this process is being undertaken, that there is a broader interest, and that there are things that are appropriate things to do and there are inappropriate things to do. The real difficult decision comes when the person is very senior in the body, right? There's no one above the person. So even if someone just discloses or everyone knows or they recuse themselves, their shadow overhangs the entire body, right? So one has to be sort of also cognizant of at what level does the conflict of interest happen. Is it a junior official who has very little influence in the regulatory capacity? Or is it a very senior official who, whether present in the room or not, it is impossible that their interest is not being considered or their view is not being considered? So again, that context matters. So like I say, it has to have a committee of independents as well as participants working through conflict. So there has to be an encouragement to put out all your interests, and an encouragement and an opportunity to work through those interests, leaving really the remnants, sort of the most extreme cases, to resolution through some form of sort of evidence and argument and natural justice.
I really like what you said there a little earlier, which is the people involved in trying to rather pass a judgment or pass an order on this should actually be actively looking to solve this, right? As opposed to thinking that their job is pretty much, okay, I hear your side, and now I pass a judgment. And that, for me, the reason why that stood out to me in what you said was because that encourages conversation in the Indian sports industry and the Indian sports ecosystem. And that's something we don't do, right? Like I started this call, we almost never talk about the stuff that's actually important in driving the sports industry. Sure, the scores, the the highlights, the achievements are all important, and that's what makes sports such an emotional and powerful driver. But not to have conversations about the things that are driving this stuff behind is, for me, is something that the Indian sports industry needs to catch up with. Which takes me actually very quickly to my next question, which is, you and I spoke at length yesterday, and we've also spoken previously on this, on how the conflict of interest, the understanding of conflict of interest has evolved over the years. But the evolution could not be, I mean, you would like the evolution to be faster, right? Always. The evolution is something that we all want to do. How is the slightly slowed down evolution of the understanding of conflict of interest impacting the sports ecosystem in general, right? Because like you said, if somebody is given the chance, like let's say I was a young, capable person, and I could only do one thing according to the BCCI list of things, and I can do that only for 3 or 4 months a year. For the remaining 8 months of the year, I'm not going to be doing anything. I can't earn anything because I don't want to be in conflict of interest. So that kind of tells me, well, I should rather move into an industry where I know I can earn for at least 10 months a year. And the Indian sports industry for now does not have that luxury, right? Whether it's the EPL, whether it's the NBA, whether it's all these international leagues, they go on for 8 to 10 months a year. So you have that consistent income. But Indian leagues are very, very short. The longest league we have is the ISL, which is about 5 or 6 months. The IPL is short. The Kabaddi League is short. So how does this the fact that this conversation around conflict of interest, which is evolving so slowly, impact what's happening on ground in the sporting ecosystem?
Yeah, so I think you can't divorce ethics and morals from neither law nor the economics and sort of the economy of sport. And the reality is, if you get conflict of interest wrong, you're actually hitting the labor market of sport very, very directly. And like you mentioned quite rightly, let's say someone is allowed to do only one job in cricket a year, which is to be an official with an IPL franchise. The other 9 months of the year, they have to do something completely unrelated to cricket, because that list is so extensive, unless you have the more nuanced view, right? What it's essentially saying is you can do this for 3 months, and we would rather you're out of the cricket ecosystem and not contributing, because this purity has to be maintained, rather than contributing in your sort of hometown, being in an academy, doing something meaningful, using some of the few skills that you have. What it also does is it sort of sets up this one man, one job type of scenario, where it also raises the cost of someone, right? So the IPL job maybe now you have to start on salary, because if you want to keep them, you can't sort of just disband them every 3 months and tell them go fishing or go and find a job in the automobile industry. So I think one might keep a certain type of person out of the industry. Two, it has the potential to actually raise costs of people, because you can't use freelancers as freely because you're subject to their conflicts. You can't hire someone who, as much as they can't do things, there are a certain category of people who are unhireable to you, right? Or have to be taken entirely on your books, which actually causes a lot of issues. And traditionally it's seen as, at the very top, I'm a former cricketer, I'm a former football player, and this is all I have, and this is all the skills. So it's not just about the people at the very top, it's everyone, and it's even down to the junior most person. The economy of sport can be impacted by things like this. And I think another thing we have to keep in mind is a non-global concept, right? So here you have the Indian selectors can't be in IPL teams, Indian coaches can't be in IPL teams, so you can't have these conflicts. But almost all of the coaches are international players. Some of them are batting coaches of the Australian team. Someone else is managing a franchise somewhere else. So in some sense, it's different rules for Indian labor, and it's different rules for the international labor. The same person who's sort of the batting coach of Australia is sort of running one of the IPL teams, and then goes back and has sort of inside information as much on all of the players, right? When India plays Australia. Do this in a piecemeal manner and look at it in a very siloed manner, you're in fact going to break systems. So one, unfairness, and two, the economics of it.
Right, and it ties it back again. What you just said ties back into what we had spoken about, what you had spoken about earlier, which is what is the result of this person's actions, right? Is there actually malicious intent behind it? And in 9 out of 10 times, I know obviously I'm sharing this number pretty much out of thin air, but I'm pretty certain that most of the time it's actually just genuine, clean, sincere intention of wanting to kind of move on or do something that's more productive, as opposed to, like you said, sitting and twiddling my thumbs for the better part of the year. So I actually wanted to kind of mention this one statement you made, and if you can kind of add to it. You had said in our call yesterday, a few skills to many as opposed to all skills to one. Where you spoke about how one of the good things about the Indian sporting ecosystem, and even just generally the global economy right now, is how people actually are a collection of skills, right? I can give X skill to one person, I can give X skill to another company, I can give a third skill to another company, and they may all be related, they may not be related, but as you specialize and as you grow older, and you spoke about older senior cricketers or older senior coaches and officials, as you grow older, as you get more experience, you become more specialized. And maybe one organization requires a particular skill, but it doesn't require skills 2 to 10. So then you can go out and find an option for 2 to 10. So how is that balance being met? Or are you seeing conversation around that? Because it's a reality. And I don't want to bring up 2020 for whatever reason, but the impact that 2020 had on us and our thinking of how the economy is going to move forward, just globally and everything, this is a relevant conversation to be had, right? You can't be looking at focusing only on one thing right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's 2020 only makes it more relevant. When you look at the future of work, right? How many people are going to be employed by one organization or one entity 5 years from now? And in particular, in a reasonably specialized area like sport, right? Is that even from a macroeconomic perspective, the appropriate use of skill and resource? You could have a multitude of skills and you offer that to one person. You could have a multitude of different skills and you offer one bit to multiple people. But like I said, the concept of specialization itself is you get really good at something. And when you get really good at something, you become actually less relevant on multitudes of things to one person. So suddenly it becomes more meaningful to be able to contribute to 5, 6, 7, 10 different entities in the thing that you're really, really good at, right? So you could be, let's say, amazing at marketing analysis and analytics. Now, IPL team doesn't have a 12-month job for you. They might just be really interested to see how their sponsors respond. And once you're done with that, you move to ISL. Once you're done with that, you move to something else. And it's a very valuable skill because it can be spread across a wider net. And in the macroeconomics of sport, you want those specialists spreading the net. Because otherwise, what you're going to get is you're just going to get it directed to the place where it's most lucrative. And that's going to end up being something like cricket. And all of the other sports also will suffer. So I think that one of the greatest things, I'm not a huge fan of sort of the IPL copy models of leagues. But what it has done is it's increased the sort of water level of professionalism. People who have learned on the IPL have gone to sports events, they've gone to non-sports events. You go and look at the quality of any event today. It's much, much higher than it was 13 or 14 years ago. So it raises standards. People who are trained in one setup go and contribute in other setups, raise the standard themselves. Other people go and pick that up. So you want the sort of person going and spreading the seeds that they picked up in one place and fertilizing other sort of areas and other sports. So if you do this very sort of archaic, over-technical conflict of interest, you're going to see less and less of that. You're going to see a few people just stuck in jobs where they might not have all of the skills, but they just need to be doing that 12 months of the year.
And what's interesting about the IPL, at least in the start, and even the ISL right at the start, you actually had that happening, which is you had this small group of people who are highly specialized that would move from league to league. Thankfully now, because of organizations that are coming up both in the recruitment space and in the sports and management education space, you're beginning to see more and more skilled people, right? And what I like is the sports education space is moving the direction of practical knowledge as opposed to theoretical knowledge. and you have this force that's going to come up, right? There is no dearth of sports educational institutions, and it's so, I feel that conversation, that evolution, if it happens faster, it will just encourage all these younger boys and girls who want to join the sports industry with dreams in their eyes. I want to visit something that we spoke about a little earlier, Nandan, and I wanted to get your point of view on it, which is, conflict of interest unfortunately gets into this space of, is this a moral or a legal issue? Right. You spoke about how conflict of interest is actually very natural in the sports industry and very often outside it as well. However, often it is treated as a moral issue where and morality is a very sensitive topic, right? Because anytime you speak about morality, it almost becomes like you use the word adversarial or, almost accusatory, that you are being immoral with the way you are dispensing your work. So how do you, I mean, and for the purpose of the guest here and for myself as well, how would you actually go through the thinking of when you see the first article in the newspaper saying conflict of interest? What is the thought process we should follow in order to break down what actually is happening behind this story?
So I think a good question, Jonathan. And we deal with it all the time in the legal profession, right? And when I say legal profession, it's a profession where there's ethics that are in the code of our profession. Perhaps in some ways, sport is more business than profession. So it doesn't necessarily come naturally hard-coded into the work, right? So in many ways, in the business, it's about profit maximization. But in our profession, we are seen as having sort of public responsibilities over and above sort of commercial interests. And we deal with conflict of interest literally every week. Very often we're asked to represent someone we've been on the other side of. We have to disclose that. Indian sport is a small space. So as lawyers, we have to get waivers, we have to disclose, we have to sort of sit out of lots of issues, and even for existing clients. It's a small world, right? But it comes hard-coded into our profession as lawyers. It is not hard-coded into the mentality or the practice of sports professionals. And I think everyone needs to consider themselves, whether a federation president or even just a logistics manager, event manager, you are sports professionals. You're not sports business people. And I think the minute you bring sort of basic ethics into the picture, it's both ethics backed by law, but most importantly, it's just a basic concept of right and wrong, right? So if you want to have a simple test, am I doing something wrong or not? Imagine it was someone else doing it. What would you think about it? Right? So use yourself as the tester. If it's not you, what is Jonathan doing? If it was not me, but it was Jonathan, what would I think of Jonathan? What would I think of the organization he works for? What would I think of the decisions he's making or the group which he's part of is making? And it's a very simple test, right? And then the simple question to ask next is this something that just is completely wrong? And whatever you do, disclose it, sit out from the meeting, will I still be satisfied or not? And at that point, it's an intractable interest. But you have to ask those questions, because you will find that in many cases, it's enough to just tell people, hey guys, I just want to let you know, this is someone I mentored 10 years ago, and I coached him for 3 months. He's in the zone of consideration. I just want to put that on the table. When he comes up for selection, I'm going to sit out of this. So you put it on the table, no one is going to but if you're still coaching that person as of that day, there's a problem, right? So even if you sit out, the fact that you have that interest may never help you get through that conflict. So it's a very simple smell test in my view.
Right. And even in the example you mentioned there, and it's a very powerful example because it specifically talks about, it's not just about actual obvious conflict of interest, it's perception of conflict of interest, right? I could be the most honest coach in the history of the game, and everybody knows this, everybody is aware of it, and I could still be coaching this guy while being on the selectors committee. But it's that perception that hangs over, that my duty is first to the selector board as opposed to, and making sure that I don't bring this kid in. So that perception is extremely important in, like you said, a public office or a quasi-public office. Nandan, I'll touch on one more topic and then we'll...
Sorry. Jonathan, just before that, in the public position, propriety is the only thing. So, I mean, that's the only relevant thing. If it actually happens, there's a even bigger issue, right? So if it actually seeps into decision-making, you have a much larger problem. but you have to just stop at the level of perception when there's a regulatory quasi-public context involved.
Right, and I think, like you said, that has to also come from within, and even I think as we evolve with the conversation of conflict of interest, I think literature around it will become clearer, the policy and the processes will become clearer, and it will just help somebody who is, for example, a coach who has coached all his life or her life, suddenly gets into a position of being a selector. Where can I read up on how can I avoid conflict of interest, or like you said, that the perception and the propriety, which actually takes me to the last topic of our conversation, and then we'll go into Q&A, which is, we clearly have seen a pretty significant evolution of the dealing of conflict of interest, both in terms of policy and in terms of process. But moving forward, say in the next 5 years, or even let's say 10 years, what are some critical steps we need to take as a sporting industry or as a sporting community that we have? And what are the critical elements to a sound conflict of interest policy? Is it something that we already know through, conflict of interest policies existing within the corporate space, or do we take encouragement or direction from some of the international sporting bodies, whether it is other sporting bodies or whether it is the global federation? What are some of the critical elements and what are some of the steps we can take towards almost putting this evolution of conflict of interest on a fast track?
Yeah, it's not easy, Jonathan. It's not like we in India are more conflicted than anyone else, or for that matter, we're worse at dealing with conflict of interest. It's a issue across global sport. I think we've talked today about the Indian context, but I mean, look at it as a global issue. It's there all over the place, right? In international federations, local federations. It's not an India-specific issue. And I think you shouldn't look at this as a moral relativism issue of we are bad at it and other people have found their way. I think it's a constant issue of understanding, sort of counseling people on understanding why this is an issue, and in some sense lowering the temperature a little bit and making people understand that it's a completely natural thing. And just to make it part of your DNA, to be conscious of these issues. And it's not just about athletes, right? It's also about young professionals. It could be lawyers, it could be agents, it could be sponsorship managers. Just beginning to start being sensitive of what roles you play. Are they private? Is there a clash between private interests? Are you communicating strongly enough to both people you have responsibilities to? Are you moving beyond that? So one, lowering the temperature. Two, increasing awareness and education about the concept itself. And I don't know whether this label is I think we're conflict avoiders essentially, right? So the minute you see conflict, you see it as dispute. Right. It is just sort of making it a natural, there are multiple interests. These are going to come into conflict. I mean, it could be something as close to, I want to do work, but my kids want to play with me. That's a conflict of interest, right? So these are there in our everyday lives. The minute they get into professional lives, it gets more complicated. These are decisions that have to be made. It's not, you can't avoid having to resolve this. But then also putting in mechanisms that are more managerial rather than judicial or sort of punishment type of things. And if you look at some of the language in the BCCI constitution, it says the person can be punished, the person can be banned if they're seen in conflict. That is not the type of language you should be using around. There will be a few situations in which extreme steps are needed, but to me, that's a very small proportion if you manage the flow. If you don't manage the flow, you don't lower the temperature, you don't increase education, and you don't manage the intermediate instances, you will only see the sort of the end result, and all of it looks bad, all of it is judicial, all of it is adversarial.
Right. And, on that note, essentially, like we had discussed yesterday, it's really critical to start managing that flow, simply because then you can also manage the direction of energy that's going towards resolving these, so-called conflicts of interest, right? Because then you actually spend your time, your resources, and let's not kid ourselves. I mean, as rich as maybe, as rich as a country we are, as much time as we have, as much energy and emotional energy we have, it's really important for our sporting industry to start focusing its energy on the right things, and we are doing that. So if a better managed, one of these elements, which is better managing conflict of interest, will help us divert our energy towards things that are actually supposed to need our attention, as opposed to just throwing the kitchen sink at everything that seems like or is perceived to be a conflict of interest.
Yeah, I mean, it's a natural
great.
friction. So when the friction happens, you deal with friction. You don't sort of outlaw it, right?
Absolutely. So I'm going to go into some Q&A, Nandan, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I'm going to start with, I think we already, so just to be clear, Nishant Daswani had asked the first question: how do we differentiate between ethical conflict in sport and unethical interest in sport, as there is a very thin line of difference? I feel like we've answered this. So if you can just quickly shoot out one or two thoughts on this question, and then we can move on to the next question.
Again, I don't want to put ethical or unethical. There's a conflict of interest which we have a problem with, which misaligns the public and private interests, and others that may not, that may just be appropriate. So I would take out the ethical and unethical, and I would look at it as appropriate, inappropriate, or more tractable, intractable, which is the terms again used in the BCCI constitution. But I think at the larger level, we try to differentiate why it's relevant and what is relevant, especially when there's a sort of quasi-public interest involved, regulatory, disciplinary, choosing one over another, balancing. Those are all acts of a public or quasi-public body.
Correct, and like you highlighted, it's also important that the language that we use around it, even I mean, it is a legal term for sure, but if the moment we start using a little softer language, it becomes a little easier. I'm going to go on to the next question from Anish Gopi. So his question is: while dealing with the representation, sorry, let me rephrase. While dealing with representation, and I'm assuming Anish means here representation of athlete interests or professional team interests or federation interest, how do we make sure the conflict of interest is negated in case there is only a sole intermediary representing the interests of both the club and the player? Is an undertaking from both sides acknowledging that they both exist sufficient?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. It comes up in many of these instances, even with agencies, right, where the person keeps a commission from both. And the simple question is, does everyone know about this? Other interests aligned. And to me, both of these are clearly private interests. And if both parties have been disclosed to, which is sort of an open question whether most people know if they're getting paid from both sides, in general, this should be okay. But you really have to think about other interests aligned. Is the agent's interest in closing a deal versus maximizing value? Because when the person is being paid from both sides, they have an interest in not allowing either party to maximize value. So the question you'll have to ask is, are they representing both adequately? So they might be balancing both interests and finding a midpoint, and overly so. And the person, in some sense, maybe the athlete with less negotiating power might get a more raw end of the deal, because, I mean, those are the questions to ask. So is it one, based on disclosure, two, based on consent? And beyond that, I mean, you really have to leave it to the athlete to be educated enough to understand the implication of the person being paid from both sides. This happens with agents, this happens with sponsorship agents. Major issue. So I think a good question, not an easy one to just answer out of thin air, but I think there are elements of consent and disclosure which are absolutely critical. Beyond that, I think it's the autonomy of parties to choose. If they're fine with it, good luck to them.
Yeah, good luck to them for sure. The next question comes from Jehan. So I'm going to just read the question, and Nandan, you answer it the way you deem fit. Jehan Mukaddum, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Jehan. Virat Kohli has been under the scanner for conflict of interest, especially with the IPL, the usage of MPL. Is this a question you'd like to address, Nandan? How would you like to go about this one?
Sub judice with the ethics officer, so I'd rather not get into it. I think it's inappropriate to comment specifically on specific cases. But I think we wanted to stick to sort of past cases and the jurisprudence rather than sort of prospect on situations we see as, live and potentially sort of in play. So I'd rather not get into specific cases which people might have differing opinions on. In this instance, I think there's probably a different forum for that.
Sure. I think the next question comes.
Same thing with anything to do with sort of sponsors and who's sponsored by maybe a federation, and also sort of any live issue we'd rather not.
Sure. So Tushar Sinha asks a question, which obviously makes a mention of a particular gentleman. Yes, does the favoring of a certain senior official member to be re-elected for the same position constitute as a conflict of interest? I'll kind of stop the question there and ask you this question. Does the favoring of a certain official, senior official member, whoever he or she may be, to be re-elected to the same position of influence or power, or like you said, quasi public office, is that constituted as a conflict of interest?
That isn't intrinsically a conflict of interest. I mean, there are multiple different conflicts of interest within voting and elections, and I think but those are structural conflict of interest only address, right? So should someone be able to stand for 8 years, 14 years? Do they need a sort of 12 years cooling off? All those are sort of based in some element of conflict of interest, that the person you need new people, you need fresh faces. So people are not getting entrenched and their interest getting further entrenched. So these are not, I mean, it's a good question because it's not a direct conflict of interest question, but it's this framework of governance that supports the essential context of a public office. That it's not someone who entrenches their private interests and puts a flag in and stays in sort of position for years and years. So the fact of limited tenure, cooling off, all of these are also sort of essential elements of managing conflict of interest, because you don't want someone so deeply entrenched that it's the reflection of who they are and who the federation is not very different. But I mean, it's not an explicit conflict of interest provision. It's a broader governance issue that comes up.
Great. The next question again is from Nishant Daswani. It's an interesting one, actually. I'll shoot it out to you. Is there a conflict of interest if somebody is in an advisory position and does not actually have administrative duties to dispense of, or does not have any administrative or any powers per se, quasi public or public powers or decision making ability? If this person is just in an advisory position, would it be considered as a conflict of interest?
So this came up very explicitly in the BCCI case, right? This cricket advice. The selectors in some sense, but eventually the decision is taken by the board president or the office bearers. And it came up that, I mean, it depends on in what capacity they're advising, right? Is the advice can be binding in some ways as well. And is that advice of a nature that is regulatory? Almost like if you get 3 judges who are advisors, 3 former Supreme Court judges, are you actually going to not listen to them? You're putting them in a position because you're taking their advice seriously and executing it, right? So again, it's just by calling someone an advisor, it doesn't change the nature of their job. It's essentially what is the level of influence that they can have.
Right. So we've got 2 more questions, and then I'll call it a wrap, Nandan. The first one is, I think, so I'll actually make it 3 quick questions, because I think the first one you can answer pretty quickly. We've already discussed it, but it's a question from Arjun Shiv. How do you think the discussion around conflict of interest is likely to shape the future of Indian sport? And are we likely to take any proactive steps to increase or impose restrictions beyond ethics officers or self-regulation? What is the trend you are seeing? I think we've answered this, but just a quick 1 or 2 sentences for it.
Yeah, I think right now I'm not very optimistic. I would love to see more work being done on this. It's a underdone and underemphasized area of governance because it's a very live issue. A lot of the other things happen once in 4 years with elections and other things like that. This is the day-to-day of fair play. So it's more like the referee on the football field. You want that person, every decision to be made for the right reason. And so this is as important as the refereeing. It's the off-field refereeing. And don't underestimate the relevance of every single decision and the various pulls and pushes and the importance of getting this right, because you need Indian sport to gain trust. I think there's a deficit, which I think we all love our sports people and their achievements, but we still need more trust, and we need to have reason to trust the people making the decisions, that there's fair play, that it's not just the people who are in there who are being benefited, but literally, I think the point that I try and make again and again is whether you're a sports person or not, sports governance matters to every single one of us. Because whether you're a sports person or not, you are a potential sports person, but you're also a fan, you're a viewer, and you are potentially influenced by sports in ways that you may not acknowledge on a day-to-day basis, which includes your identity, your perception of your own body, your capabilities. All of these are public elements of sport, which you are absolutely a stakeholder on. So I think everyone must care about governance in general, but also this, the basic policing of sport. And policing, again, is probably a too harsh a word, but just the ensuring of fair play within the sports ecosystem, to making sure people who deserve to get their chances, and that the decision making and regulation and rule making are undertaken with right considerations and with sort of public mindedness in mind.
Right. So again, the next question is something that you've already addressed from Pranav Subramaniam. So, it is basically, he says, presently there are a lot of COI cases, conflict of interest cases, and the jurisprudence does not appear to be evolving sufficiently. Do you think the rules are being read rather too literally? I think the rules are pretty literal. You've already answered this, but one or two sentences on this, Nandan, and we've got one more question and we close.
Yeah, I think, like I said, there's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel after the Rahul Dravid case. But unfortunately, there's very little that's been done to educate people after that, right? Saying people are still scared to take these more than one position, because, I mean, again, people don't want to be accused of conflict of interest. So a little bit more education of sports professionals on the concept itself, making it very clear that it's not, you can't have more than two jobs, is just go through the process. But also a more friendly sort of setup, like I said, to help people to work through their conflicts and making it a collaborative process, a non-adversarial, non-adjudicatory process, leaving that for sort of the end game only if it's absolutely necessary. So like I said, I'm not optimistic, but I'm hopeful. And I think those are not necessarily...
Right. The last question for the session, Nandan, comes from Surbhi Kulvekar. I hope I pronounced your name right, Surbhi. Do you foresee heightened conflict of interest situations with the argument for a push towards player-led governance and involvement in governing bodies, and perhaps specifically in disciplinary case management such as doping? What might be a good strategy to write safeguards into governance regulations?
Very interesting point. I'm assuming the perception here is that athletes in governance will be more favorable to athletes.
I had the same this one.
Sort of perception of being biased as a concept, not biased in sort of actuality. We'll have to think a little bit more about that. Are athletes going to favor athletes, or for that matter, are athletes going to carry the baggage of all of the things they've had to deal with and come back with a vengeance against people they don't like? Very, very interesting question. Normally, you stick to sort of demonstrable interests, not sort of these implicit biases. And I think once you get into implicit bias and the influences you had in the past and your past experience, I think this makes it almost an unmanageable thing, right? Because anyone can be accused of being favorable to athletes, non-favorable to athletes. There might be some referees who are more likely to call a red card against people of a certain race. I mean, you can go into this to an nth degree. So I don't want to sort of either trivialize it or overcomplicate it. I think we have to keep this as a reasonably simple, easy to understand, easy to implement. And I wouldn't call it bright lines, because it's not obvious until you actually get into it. But the ability to, like you said, have conversations and to understand it with some nuance and to work through these, because I think there is a valuable end goal, and all of us are interested in working towards the maximization of value in Indian sport. And you can do that only if you're able to overcome a lot of these issues, because these are weights that sit on our legs in moving forward.
Great. Nandan, actually, just one question has quickly popped up. I think if you can leave a couple of statements, and then, which is from Satyanarayanan Iyer Gopalan, SIG for short. Considering the level of influence involved through the role of scouts, which is pretty important, often such players are recommended by scouts and are called for trials for further analysis, and that's the part of a scout, right? That's what a scout does fundamentally. Is that a conflict of interest, and how would ideally this be perceived
intrinsically,
in the context
scouting,
of conflict of interest?
Intrinsically, I don't think scouting is intrinsically a conflict of interest, but the reality is, I don't think most often they are engaged with the person they are scouting, right? So they're not paid by, they're going out and trying to find people and being able to bring them to a selection trial or for two selections. So I don't see a natural, basic, intrinsic conflict of interest, but there might be a situational one, and I think you'd have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. Is the person exerting some influence on the athlete of where they should go, which trial they should go to, keeping them out of other trials? And there are other safeguards, right, of not being able to sign a minor athlete. I mean, that the legal system has many different safeguards, and conflict of interest sits in the sort of middle of all of them and is in many ways upheld by many of them. So if you're looking at people who are of low negotiating ability, capable of being influenced, there are other mechanisms in place. And at the end of the day, like I said, what is sports governance? Finding balance between their different interests. Are you by different interests? Absolutely. The role of sports governance is to allow yourself to be hit by everything, right? Players, interests, their opportunities, sponsors who want to pay you and take stuff away, broadcasters who want to carry your stuff, people who want to come and watch your matches. So it's all these private interests. But one, being able to stave them off, and two, being able to accept what you should accept. So a very fine balance. And unless you get the alignments right, you could be sort of on the wrong track, and lots left on the table for sport in general.
Nandan, on that note, I know that this is a conversation we can keep having, just as every conflict of interest case should be a conversation before it actually gets to the highlight or a headline on a news item saying conflict of interest. I like how they make it bold and make it sound like as the world is going to come to an end tomorrow. But thanks for your time, Nandan. I genuinely enjoyed this, and I say this categorically, not because I'm saying this in front of X number of people, but I always leave a conversation with Nandan Kamath a much smarter person. So, thanks for your time. I'm looking forward to doing this again in session 2. And over to you, Yogita.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you, Nandan and Jonathan, for taking your time off this evening and joining us for this discussion. It's indeed been very insightful. Thank you to all our viewers as well for joining us this evening. This brings us to the end of the first session of Sports Law 101. Do join us again next week as we have the Sports Law and Policy Network's panel discussion on the impact of biobubbles on athlete mental health. For the convenience of our viewers, we're just going to leave the registration link in the chat box here, but do follow our social media for further updates. Thank you.